Odongo yawa asikaleki Odongo yawa Timbegi mora Odongo yawa asikaleki Pile pile asikaleki Pile pile waimakuia Pile pile sikamani Pile pile waimakuia Odongo yawa Timegi mora yawa Sama chwako chai Awero wendegi samadhi yaura Awero gendegi Odongo yawa Kata mino abendo ye Yawa odongo yawa Itago wia Pile pile asikaleki Pile pile waimakuia Pile pile sikamani Pile pile waimakuia
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I had a little Zoom connectivity issue there, true to form in these virtual days, but welcome. My name is Sarah Sikic, and I work in support of partnerships and fundraising with UC Santa Barbara's National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCEAS. NCEAS is celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and we're so glad that you've joined us for this celebratory seminar series. Today's event marks the last of our series, and we hope that you've been able to join others, but if you haven't, you can find them on our YouTube site. You're in for a treat today while we hear from Kaitlyn Gaynor. Kaitlyn is a postdoctoral researcher with NCEAS, and she'll be discussing her research on the cascading impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on wildlife. How wildlife are responding to the pandemic has piqued broad interest, and many of us have had our own experience or heard anecdotal stories of how wild animals are responding to the pandemic. But Kaitlyn will share with you how she's using data science to explore real trends. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items and provide a quick introduction. This event is a webinar format, so please feel free to type any questions that you have throughout the presentation into the chat function at any time, and we'll get to them after Kaitlyn's presentation. And if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please feel free to contact the UCSB virtual events staff in the chat function. Before we turn to Kaitlyn, I'd like to introduce Ben Halpern, Director of NCEAS. He will give an overview of the center. Ben has been involved with NCEAS for more than 2 decades, and he's also a professor at UC Santa Barbara's Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. Ben's research interests span a wide range of disciplines, from marine ecology to food sustainability. And earlier this year, he received the high honor of being elected as an Ecological Society of America Fellow for his outstanding contributions to ecology and conservation. Please join me in a warm but quiet Zoom welcome for Ben.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really exciting to have you with us. I'll keep my comments very brief because I know you're here to hear Kaitlyn speak and not me, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of the center, NCEAS, that I direct and where Kaitlyn is sitting. As Sarah said, we've been around for 25 years, and over that time, we've brought in thousands and thousands of researchers from around the world to help tackle a whole range of ecological and environmental science questions in team science groups that help bring disciplines and ideas and data together, synthesizing new insight and accelerating discovery. And it's a really exciting model for how to find answers to really important questions and to connect science to solutions that really help us understand the way the world works and how we can better manage it. We tackle this through managing teams and supporting them, through bringing together data in lots of really exciting ways, and importantly, training people to be able to do the kind of research we support and to use the tools that we are developing and making available, all in a very open and transparent way. So it's a really exciting place to be, exciting portfolio of work that we support, and a really a transformative way of bringing science to bear on environmental problems and solutions. So I invite you to learn more about it through our website, and of course, reaching out to me if you have any questions. But I'm now excited to introduce Kaitlyn. She is a director's postdoc here at the center, and first got a Schmidt Fellowship and is now under the director's postdoc in a pivot that we really celebrate at NCEAS, where she was trained as a behavioral ecologist and now is embracing environmental data science as a new discipline and a new set of tools to answer questions. And this kind of synthesis of ideas and disciplines and data is really at the heart of what we do. And it's a real honor to be part of Kaitlyn's trajectory into this new way of doing research and to support her in that path. As you heard from Sarah, she's doing some really exciting work that's enormously relevant to the situation we're in right now. And so with no further ado, I turn the tables to Kaitlyn. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. So thanks for joining today. I'm really happy to be here to discuss some ongoing work that I've been conducting as a resident postdoc here at NCEAS. I've been here a little over a year, and the flexibility of the director's postdoc position has afforded me this opportunity to develop and participate in really timely research collaborations related to the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'd like to share with you today. And I know that we're all probably thinking about COVID-19 too much, so my apologies for that, but I hope this work leaves you with some slightly different perspectives on the pandemic and its fallout, and highlights some opportunities for synthesis, science, and conservation in its wake. So as the human population and footprint are expanding globally, our actions are having an outsized effect on the other species on this planet, with implications for the conservation of biodiversity and also for human health. The recent spillover of the coronavirus from animals to people has highlighted this and really placed the relationship between humans and wildlife under a global spotlight. And the pandemic has highlighted how biodiversity and the ways in which we choose to interact with and protect with other species can very directly impact human health. And the widespread societal upheaval associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and the shelter-in-place orders have underscored further links between people and animals and also highlighted limitations in our current conservation strategies. I'm going to be discussing the bottom arrow today. If we don't prioritize biodiversity conservation, we will not only witness continued extinction, loss of species, but also consequences for human societies, like more pandemics. And so my colleagues and I have been trying to understand the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for wildlife to learn lessons to design more effective conservation strategies. And I'm going to discuss two kind of parallel lines of research. First, I'm going to discuss some ongoing work on how the pandemic can shed light on how to better manage wildlife and recreation in our national parks here in the United States. And then second, I'll zoom out to discuss global consequences of the pandemic for conservation in the developing world. So here in the United States, the protected area model for wildlife conservation is one of the dominant strategies for conserving many of our country's vulnerable species. And the National Park Service has this dual mandate to both conserve wildlife and wild lands while providing for recreation opportunities for current and future generations of Americans. And this dual mandate is increasingly difficult to reconcile given rapid increases in visitation to US national parks. This figure indicates the growth in visitation since the inception of the national park system. And if we zoom in just on the last 20 years, we can see a rapid increase really within the last decade, which has been raising a lot of questions and conversations about the impact of visitors on the wildlife in the park that we are meant to be conserving. Recreation can have a number of negative effects on wildlife, and this is an area where I've conducted work previously as part of my PhD. And animals fear and avoid human activity. Work has documented changes in habitat selection, movement, feeding, the daily activity patterns of animals in response to hiking, camping, physical infrastructure. And recreation-induced changes in behavior can also scale up to alter fitness and reproduction. We stress animals out, they might reproduce less, we might reduce their access to important habitat and thus effectively reduce the carrying capacity of these parks. And recreation can also disturb reproduction itself. For example, birds often abandon their nests after being disturbed by people. And finally, animals are frequently struck by vehicles in national parks, which leads to, of course, an increase in mortality. And it's possible that all of these negative impacts of recreation on wildlife could be leading to population declines or holding populations at lower levels than they might otherwise be at, and interrupt important ecological dynamics, which could be compromising the mission of the National Park Service to conserve wildlife. Some animals might also benefit from certain aspects of visitation. For example, if animals, predators, avoid human activity. In Glacier National Park, mountain goats spend a lot of time in areas of human disturbance where they're safer from grizzly bears that avoid people. And animals might also seek out food and mineral subsidies associated with humans. So those same mountain goats in Glacier seek out areas where people are actually urinating because that's an important source of minerals for them. But some of these benefits of human visitation, I call them benefits, but they might not be desirable in the long term because this kind of behavior, seeking out human food sources, can create conflict with people and may eventually lead to the removal of these animals for the sake of visitor safety. And so to understand these impacts of visitors on wildlife in parks, we decided to leverage the COVID-19 shutdown as a natural experiment. So most of the national parks were shut down for a period in the spring. It's reflected in these annual visitation numbers here, which show the number of monthly visitors to the entire national park system over the 3 previous years as compared to 2020 in red. And so by examining how patterns of animal behavior, reproduction, and mortality changed in response to the change in visitation, we can better isolate and understand the consequences of recreation for wildlife. And many of you have probably seen the headlines from earlier this year about how wildlife in national parks were just throwing a party in our absence, thriving during the lockdowns. It seems anecdotally like the pandemic has offered a reprieve for animals, particularly those that experience the negative consequences of recreation. we decided to explore these behavioral changes systematically. Are these just headlines, or is there something real to this? So with a number of collaborators across institutions in the National Park Service, we're compiling GPS data from tracked large mammals across national park sites to see what the animals were doing during the shutdown and test some broader hypotheses about the effects of recreation on animals. And we're far from the only group doing this. Several researchers noted in a recent paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution that the COVID-19 shutdowns offer a unique natural experiment that they're calling the anthropause. And we've been seeing that synthesis science has been a really valuable avenue for combining big data sets on human mobility with data on animal movement and activity. And during my postdoc at NCEAS, I've been able to join several of these collaborations as a working group participant, in addition to leading this study on the national parks. And there is value to this synthesis approach to combining data sets across different species and comparing COVID-induced changes to understand which species are most affected by humans and allocate our conservation efforts accordingly. This is just an image of all the species that we're including so far in our synthesis study in the parks. And even within species, synthesis approaches allow us to tease apart differences across individual animals and understand processes of habituation, because certain animals might be very comfortable with human activity, others might be more wary. And by understanding how animals in different areas of the parks respond to the shutdown, we can better understand behavioral plasticity and patterns of habituation. There's also value in comparing changes in animal behavior across parks too, given that different parks have different levels of baseline visitation, and therefore changes during COVID will be very different. And so we can explore how COVID differentially affected the activity of, for example, a bear in Yosemite to a bear in Glacier or a bear in Alaska, and explore how that might inform management of visitation to minimize impact in these different contexts. And so we're currently in the process of collating data, uploading it to NCEAS servers, and developing reproducible open workflows that I learned here at NCEAS as a postdoc to standardize these data sets, visualize them, and analyze them as they're trickling in. Unfortunately, I don't have any results to show you yet, but we have been preparing for this synthetic analyses to test hypotheses that we've been sketching out about how animal behavior might change during the shutdown and how these changes might vary across space and across species. We don't have results, but I can share with you some more anecdotes from our colleagues across the parks to give you a sense of what's been going on. We've seen changes in behavior that suggest a reversal of the typical effects of humans on wildlife. Animals seem to be using areas they previously avoided in many parks. Anecdotally, for example, bighorn sheep in Zion have been seen at a campground for the first time since it was first created in 1993 in prime bighorn habitat. Pronghorn and Death Valley are in areas near roads where they've never been. Monk seals in Hawaiian parks are hanging out on shorelines that are usually full of tourists. 2020 was also a record year for breeding cormorants at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Peregrine and Yosemite nested in areas that were typically used by climbers. So we're looking to see if we can tease apart maybe some of the environmental variation that happened in 2020 versus the changes in visitation to understand impacts on fitness. And there have been far fewer vehicle collisions as vehicle traffic is down. Yosemite typically gets a huge number of bear vehicle collisions, but as visitor numbers have been much reduced this year due to a kind of reservation system limiting people in the park, there have been fewer bears killed. There's also been anecdotally less amphibian roadkill during the spring migrations up in Acadia in Maine. And for animals that benefit from human subsidies, we might expect their behavior and diet to change as well. One of my favorite anecdotes is that the Grand Canyon squirrels are usually like fat and numerous, and this year there are fewer of them and they're all skinny. So I mean, take that for what it's worth. I think some of these changes might only be affecting a very small number of individual animals in the park, but others might be having much greater effects. And so that's what we're hoping to dig into. And while many of the national parks were shut down entirely in the spring, I'm sure many of you can imagine or know firsthand that there have been large spikes in visitation in the summertime through the fall as people were eager to get outdoors during the pandemic. I know I spent more time in national parks than I ever have, given that my normal travel was disrupted. And this spike in visitation often happened immediately after the complete shutdown, which led to some interesting interactions between people and animals. In a lot of cases, animals got used to the visitor-free parks. They didn't always readily adapt to the increase in visitation. Otters in Lassen National Park, for example, had set up a den in the lake during the shutdown and then started attacking kayaks and swimmers after the park reopened, to the point that they had to close the lake for recreation. And many parks have also reported increases in conflict with black bears this year. Many of the people visiting parks were first-time campers who didn't know how to store food properly. Many parks were also understaffed due to the pandemic, fewer staff than usual, but also more visitors than usual, which led to overflowing dumpsters. And also a lot of bears that had come out of hibernation, set up a good routine in the park in the absence of people. And then when people came back, the bears didn't want to leave. And so the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated changes in visitation provide this unique lens into the impact of recreation on wildlife in parks. And based on the findings of this and other ongoing work, we can think about how we can manage visitation in parks, both the number of visitors and the areas people are allowed to visit, to limit their impacts on sensitive species while still providing for recreation. And we're working very closely with partners at the National Park Service to try and inform this dual mandate, with the end goal of sustainable recreation and conservation in parks to preserve our national heritage for future generations. And I'll now turn to the kind of second branch of research that I've been working on this summer, less of a data science approach, more of just a interdisciplinary synthesis approach, trying to understand how we can develop more resilient global conservation and development strategies in the wake of this pandemic. So the pandemic and its fallout are affecting wildlife not only by changing where people go or where they don't go, which might directly affect animal behavior, but also through many other pathways. The pandemic has reshaped institutions and institutional priorities and altered economic and livelihood dynamics around the world. And also the disease itself and policies that are put in place to prevent future pandemics and spillover will also affect wildlife populations and habitats. And so my colleagues and I, in a study that came out, I think it was last week, we cataloged about 16 different pathways that link the pandemic to wildlife populations and habitats, drawing on previous work that we had done on armed conflict and its effect on animals, to try and understand and anticipate what some of these effects might be so that we can best design conservation strategies after the pandemic. So I'll go through some of those pathways now. The first, which we've been discussing, is this refuge effect of reduced human activity, which has received, I would say, the lion's share of attention. But I think that these positive outcomes for wildlife are most likely localized and transient and limited to the periods of extreme lockdown in March and April, and maybe, unfortunately, the months ahead now. But while many people were staying put, many other people were moving. There were mass exoduses of people from urban areas. This is a photograph earlier this year from India, where people may have to rely more on natural resources in the rural areas that they're going to. And changing institutional dynamics are likely to be very important in the COVID context. Safety concerns related to the virus have led to reduced enforcement and weakened local institutions. And we've already seen reports of increased poaching in several places in Africa. Traditional institutions have also been weakened as communities attempt to reduce the spread of the virus. And at national scales, environmental regulations are being rolled back under the guise of economic recovery. And particularly in low-income countries, the economic fallout of the pandemic, I think, has highlighted the over-reliance of conservation on international ecotourism and aid, as international travel has halted because of the stay-at-home orders and funding has slowed. And so I think a lesson here is that conservation and natural resource management efforts that invest in locally managed institutions are best situated to mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic and also foster resilience to future shocks. And of course, as a background to all of this, we are seeing global economic collapse, which is most likely not going to be good for wildlife. We may see some potential benefits if trade slows or extractive industries are shut down under really strict social distancing orders, but generally these are essential, considered to be essential activities, and on the whole, it's anticipated that short-term economic crises will take priority over conservation. And on a local level, there's likely increased demand for natural resources, which I'll get into further in a moment. The disease itself may potentially spill back over into other species and very directly affect them. There's evidence that some other species are capable of contracting the coronavirus. Hopefully it won't be as lethal as it has been for humans, but there are concerns, for example, with endangered mountain gorillas and the possibility of tourists to transmit the disease to them. And there were also some brief concerns that wildlife products would be used to treat COVID in traditional medicine. This is unlikely to have widespread consequences, but it is another way in which the disease might affect wildlife. I think a really big question that remains is how policies around wildlife trade and wildlife consumption are going to change in the wake of the pandemic. There's been a lot of conversation about how can we prevent further outbreaks. And it's been a really big debate with some people and organizations calling for a total ban on wildlife consumption. Others have called for more nuance, which is kind of where my colleagues and I had landed. I think that while many forms of international wildlife trade and trafficking should certainly be curbed, the criminalization, just blanket criminalization of wildlife consumption may harm vulnerable populations and also weaken trust in institutions. This was observed in West Africa after the recent Ebola outbreak, where wildlife trade bans just really backfired. And so policies that provide food and livelihood alternatives that seek to understand the drivers of wild meat consumption and address those rather than just criminalize consumers of wild meat are likely to be more effective and also equitable than universal bans. And so by laying out and disentangling all of these complex interacting pathways linking the pandemic to outcomes for wildlife and for conservation, we can better understand the socio-ecological dynamics that link people and wildlife and ecosystems that are all experiencing this shock collectively. And hopefully this understanding can facilitate the development and implementation of more effective responses to the current crisis and inform targeted policy interventions. And that same group of colleagues and I also adapted that global socio-ecological approach to anticipate how COVID-19 may be mediating at a household level the impacts of people on wildlife and other natural resources, particularly among rural and poor households in low-income countries. And for this paper, we drew on the natural capitals framework, which is used in livelihoods research to understand how people balance a portfolio of social capital, human capital, financial capital, physical capital, and natural capital, which I'll explain, to sustain themselves and to cope with shocks. And so hypothetically, a household might have some balanced portfolio, rely on all of these things to meet their needs. But when COVID-19 hit, we're anticipating that as access to all these other types of capital decline, the use of natural capital will rise. And there's evidence from other public health contexts to suggest that this is the case. Human capital refers to just the ability of people to work, their health, which of course is very directly impacted by disease. In the context of chronic disease like HIV and AIDS, we see that morbidity and mortality often leads to declines in agricultural production, which has been linked to increases in hunting as a result. In Kenyan fishing communities, people use more environmentally destructive practices when they're sick because they're physically less able to engage in the more environmentally friendly practices. Of course, we'll see different dynamics in the COVID context, given that it's not a chronic disease, but we might see short kind of spikes in natural resource use because of declining human capital. For example, this was seen in the Ebola outbreak. Financial capital refers to wages, savings, basically money. And that has also taken a hit during the pandemic. Remittances, which are payments that individuals make that back to their home communities from abroad or from urban areas, have declined dramatically as a result of the pandemic. And in many cases, these remittances are essential to the survival of people in rural communities. But as jobs have been lost and wages have been lost, remittances have halted. We've also seen in the case of other health contexts that in order to pay medical bills, people often rely on predatory lending. And then in order to pay back these lenders, people get trapped in these predatory lending schemes and end up having to over-harvest natural resources, which has been documented in some fisheries in South America. It's possible that the declining financial capital that's available to households in rural areas will increase their reliance on natural resources. Social capital has also declined for all of us in this pandemic. With social distancing, we've got less access to our resources, safety nets, networks, formal and informal groups that we rely on. And physical capital, which refers to the infrastructure that moves goods for sale and consumption. And we've got breakdowns in supply chains and transportation that reduce access to goods and services. For example, in Kenya, shortages in natural gas earlier this year led to increases in timber harvest illegally for charcoal production. And so increased reliance on natural capital will have negative conservation outcomes. Animals might be over-harvested, incentives for conservation might disappear, and future shocks may have potentially irreversible consequences like extinction. And this erosion of natural capital will also have negative consequences for the people that rely on those natural resources and compound these detrimental impacts on livelihoods and capitals. So in the aftermath of this pandemic, we're suggesting that we need to invest in robust local, social, and institutional structures that strengthen households' portfolios of diverse capitals and improve community resilience to all types of shocks. And these investments can help us change feedback loops between biodiversity and human health, which after the pandemic might be spiraling downward, leading to negative outcomes for human health, negative outcomes for the environment, kind of feeding back. But we have an opportunity to promote more healthy ecosystems and healthy human societies and meet goals related to conservation and human health and livelihoods. And so conservation strategies that consider this coupled nature of human societies and ecosystems rather than trying to address them separately can most effectively safeguard biodiversity while addressing people's needs and be more resilient to future shocks. I think if we actually, I know this has been kind of negative, but I think we can use COVID-19 as an opportunity to learn lessons about conservation weaknesses. And if we don't, we risk continued biodiversity decline. And I think another important lesson generally is that conservation must not be pitted against economic recovery. We can also rely on one-size-fits-all solutions to this pandemic, given that there are very different social and ecological dynamics operating in different contexts. And this interdisciplinary approach to studying these interconnections between the health of animals, of humans, of the environment, has formed the cornerstone of this new One Health field of research, also called planetary health. And I anticipate that we're going to see a lot more of this in the wake of the pandemic, where ecologists are going to be joining forces with people from different disciplines. And on that note, I want to acknowledge that the work that I've discussed today was highly collaborative. Scientists and managers from different academic institutions and agencies and disciplines like public health, sociology, data science, ecology have all helped out with the projects that I've presented. So I want to acknowledge their contributions and just call on more synthetic interdisciplinary science to tackle these complex issues. It's not something we can do alone. And I think that's where places like NCEAS are really great because they bring together people from different disciplines, approaching questions from very different angles. And I'm very grateful to NCEAS for the support to conduct all of this work, not just the support of the director's postdoc that affords me the freedom to tackle these questions, but also the social network, the professional network, data science training and technical support, in the science communication support. Francisco helped me put together this talk today. And also just the ability to interact with a diverse set of thinkers. I think NCEAS has been just an amazing place to be as a postdoc, and I'm excited to stay on. And yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this work and sharing hopefully some results from the ongoing research the next time we all convene. But in the meantime, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much, Kaitlyn. That was really, really interesting. Some questions coming in. I encourage people to post their questions in the Q&A and I'll relay them to Kaitlyn, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. And you kind of hinted to it at the end, but I'm just curious what you think, like we can learn from the pandemic about conservation strategies that might be generalizable versus things that this is just such a unbelievably different and big scale and affecting all aspects of life that are things that maybe are unique to this situation. So like, what do you, maybe on the positive, what do you think we can draw from this really amazing terrible but amazing experiment that's happened on nature, and how that can inform our conservation strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. I think, yeah, I mean, I think that it's such a shock that it allows us to see how things have been perturbed. And, you know, in many cases, for example, in the case of the national parks, just removing visitors, of course, that's not a realistic conservation strategy going forward. We're not just going to remove visitors. And of course, the responses of animals to that removal don't necessarily map onto how they would respond to decreases in visitation. But I think that taking advantage of it as a natural experiment is probably the best way to approach it, not necessarily a template. You know, we don't want to like recreate certain aspects of this pandemic, of course. But yeah, I do think it's important, especially in the kind of the second part of the work that I discussed. That's just, we're talking about such complicated dynamics. I think you really do need to get into very specific context to understand what the dynamics are and how we can address them.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. A question from Julia online that just is focusing on the origins of COVID, and sort of asking about, you know, the general focus has been on shutting down these wet markets where it was thought to come from, and implementing wildlife trade bans that often are in developing countries. I'm just wondering, how do you feel about that, instead of, say, focusing on the risks associated with industrial agriculture or other variables that maybe have bigger impacts on conservation that are often common in developed countries? So this kind of inequitable lens that we're putting on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily zero sum, you know, one versus the other, but I do think, you know, I think that some of these conversations around wildlife trade bans and wet markets are oversimplified and frankly racist in some contexts. And I think that that's what I was trying to get at when I was saying I think we need to think more in a more nuanced way about what the drivers of consumption are, and understand why are people purchasing these goods, and how can we address those drivers, as opposed to just criminalizing it. Because I don't think criminalizing it is necessarily going to stop it. It's just maybe going to you know, make some people's lives very difficult, but in many cases that are already very difficult. So yeah, I mean, I think there are plenty of good conversations that we need to have about, I mean, now we're getting into like, what do we need to prioritize in terms of like global conservation strategies, which is definitely beyond the scope of my own individual expertise. But I think your question gets to a good point, which is that there is not, it's not going to be simple. It's not as simple as just shutting down wet markets and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. I definitely resonated with your comment about jumping into the national parks once they open again, because certainly in this time of lockdown, like going out into nature is one of the few things we're allowed to do, and it's very kind of rejuvenating. But as you pointed out, it puts a lot of pressure on these parks, and I'm wondering if you and your colleagues from the park system have thought about what this means for like post-pandemic management of the parks. Like I know some parks like Yosemite and Zion already implement like limits to people going in there and traffic flow. Some roads are shut down and you can only use the shuttles and things like that. Like, is that a good strategy for thinking about managing the wildlife human interaction and the increasing attendance in the parks, or is there other things we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Yosemite, for the first time ever, you couldn't get into the park without a reservation, and I think that it made a lot of people unhappy. I mean, there's this tension, right, between, speaking of like equity, like access and trying to get everyone outside and give everyone that opportunity while also mitigating the impacts. But I do think it's important not only for wildlife management and conservation and natural resource conservation, but also visitor experience. I mean, no one wants to be sitting in traffic jams. That's not fun for anybody. Yes, we've been having these conversations, and actually just reached out to some folks that are working on the visitor side of things and thinking about expanding. I mean, of course, that's something that we're really interested in beyond wildlife ecology, to think about how we can bring them into this conversation. I think the national parks, many of them are set up in a way that I think a lot of the human activity is clustered in certain areas of the park, and there are big wilderness areas that are open. But there is a question, what I'm interested in understanding is how backcountry hiking and camping, which we think of as like, leave no trace, minimal impact, may actually be having a decent impact on species in the backcountry, that this shutdown gives us the opportunity to quantify. And maybe it does mean, closing certain trails, but yeah, it's a conversation that is definitely happening within the National Park Service as those visitor numbers are just going up and up and up. How we can, that dual mandate of providing recreation and conservation is increasingly difficult to reconcile.
Yeah, and the equity dimension of it is so important and challenging. I mean, already the parks, are more accessible to certain parts of our population than others. And if you start implementing caps, you're just limiting even access even further. And yeah, I don't know if you have
I mean, I think it speaks, I think, to the importance also of creating more green spaces in urban areas and suburban areas. We can't just expect the national parks or state parks even to absorb all of our demand for outdoor recreation. So how can we, I think that what the pandemic has shown is that there's a hunger and a need for being outside. And I expect that this blip that we saw and spikes of people spending time outside will probably not be a complete blip. Like people that, I mean, I know I actually bought a bunch of outdoor gear that I didn't have before this year, and I'm going to intend to use it next year. So I think that, yeah, we definitely need to think about how we can create opportunities for recreation that are minimally invasive to conservation.
Yeah, we actually have another project going on at NCEAS that's looking at the role of nature and green space, or blue space if it's the oceans, on human mental health. And I think there's some interesting lessons we're going to be learning from this pandemic about how people have needed and used nature to really help deal with some of the stress and anxiety of everything else in their life, and that will hopefully propagate past the pandemic into greater emphasis and investment in urban green space and other things. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. Another question came in from Courtney, just asking whether the shutdown has led to any loss of data or research opportunities in our wild spaces, and are there any data that you wish you had available that you could answer, more questions like this? Certainly many field studies have been shut down, but so I'm curious your perspective and the implications of that.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is something that the Long-Term Ecological Research Network based at NCEAS has been grappling with, how to safely continue these long-term monitoring during the pandemic. Yeah, the national parks, I did lose data, and I think that has been, it's been an issue in terms of long-term monitoring. Fortunately, a lot of the essential monitoring has continued because it can be done outside in a socially distanced and safe way, which has been good. But yeah, I think in terms of any more data, I think, of course, it's like the animals that we're seeing the most interesting anecdotes for are the ones that don't have collars on them. I think something that this synthesis effort has really highlighted to me is just the disparity in our research efforts across species and systems. Charismatic parks and charismatic species tend to get the funding and the attention. Just the difference between Yosemite versus Sequoia and Kings Canyon and the resources that they have, both from the Park Service, from donors to monitor wildlife, are very different. And so I think that we're actually looking to trying to quantify this systematically a bit, like what is the bias in our collection of data in the national parks, both in terms of parks and species, and how might that bias be affecting the way that we understand human wildlife interactions in the parks? Because if we're drawing lessons that we're trying to make, half of our collar data are from like the greater Yellowstone ecosystem right now. And so what does that say about national parks in the United States? So yeah, I guess that the kind of takeaway for me there is that we do need to think about how we can get those less charismatic species and charismatic parks the funding that they need to be collecting the data that they need.
Yeah, that's a systematic problem with all aspects of wildlife management. We see it in endangered species. There's like 10 species that get 90% of the funding to help think about mitigation strategies for extinction risk. It's just the nature of how public interest in funding seems to go, but it is a real problem for understanding the broader context, which is why synthesis like you're doing can be so powerful, right? Because you do draw whatever you can from these other parks that maybe have less data, and learn from the ones that have more data what might be relevant for the ones that have less data. So. Exactly. Any other questions? I don't see any coming in. I'll speak for another minute or two to see if any other questions come in, but just want to say thank you, Kaitlyn, for like a really rich I know you're not yet at the full results stage, but sometimes it's really fun to see science as it's unfolding and see how the mind of a scientist works as we try to find patterns and understanding and what is coming out of the data. So it's been really exciting to see what you guys are working on in both of these contexts within the Park Service and more broadly about how wildlife is responding to this really unprecedented global situation we're in. So we'll end a little bit early and give people a little bit of their time back for this day, but I just want to thank you again, Kaitlyn, for a really interesting talk and your time and contributing to that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks to everyone for joining.
All right, have a good rest of the day, everyone.